and gentlemen, let's make a start. Good, thank you very much. I think virtually everybody who's around the table has been here. Perhaps not you, Mrs. Johnson?
I was here this morning.
So you understand where to go when the fire breaks out, etc., etc. Hopefully, yes. Good. Okay, I'm not going to then go through any sort of introduction other than to say I'm Keith Holland doing this part of the examination, and we'll be dealing with the historic environment this afternoon. I'm going to start with some member amendments. We've had amendments from Deputy Gardner, Deputy Morrell, and Deputy Hewlin. I think, as far as I understood it, and I saw SR 41, 47, 48, and 49, the Minister is minded to agree in the amendments. I don't know if people are content or if they want to raise any matters about them. Yes, Mr. Hewlin.
Thank you, sir. I don't know if there's misunderstanding or way I've interpreted it or whatever, and I'm prepared to take it on the chin if I've got it wrong and potentially wasted anybody's time. But reading it through, my intent is not just the windows are replaced, but the frames around those windows are allowed to be replaced as well. The dialogue I've been having with the officers has all been in that direction, for which I thank them because it's been very helpful and productive. So I don't know how you'd like to proceed, sir.
Which is the amendment? Which is the
double glazing?
Yes, I know. Which is the SR number? Do you know?
47.
47. So the Minister is proposing the amendments that I see in red on page 167, and some further amendments that he's added as well in green. And you're concerned, it's the wording of that you're a bit worried about, is it, Mr. Hewlin?
Well, I think look, I'm not skilled enough to go through the minute of the wording, but I'd just like to be avoided, if there's any avoidance of any doubt, that the replacement of the windows does include the frames.
Yeah. Can the States help us on this?
Yes, sir. I think the Minister, well, perhaps if I rewind and perhaps Deputy Hewlin might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the intent of Deputy Hewlin's amendments is to try and secure enhanced thermal performance of historic buildings, and a way of achieving that is to permit greater flexibility to the installation of double glazing in historic buildings. And I think the Minister is content to support the principle behind that amendment, particularly in light of things like the climate change and climate emergency. But I think the Minister is also seeking to balance that with the obligations that he has to ensure that the historic fabric and essential character of historic buildings is not lost as part of that process. So I think the Minister is minded to support the thrust of the Deputy's amendment, and just to clarify, so the Deputy's amendment is that which is indicated in red in the in that statement response, with the Minister's proposals in green. And essentially the essence of the Minister's position is that where it's acceptable to install double glazing where there's either no existing historic glass, or where that double glazing can be incorporated within existing historic window frames, then the Minister's minded to support that position, sir. I think in terms of the case of the replacement of the window frames themselves, I think the test would remain as it is under the current policy regime, sir, in the sense that the current position is that the replacement of the window frame and the fabric of the historic building is not supported unless there's sufficient justification that it is beyond repair. And I think this just touches on the wider principle of the importance of ensuring that we seek to protect the historic fabric of our heritage assets. And often, sir, that concerns the finer detail of those buildings, because quite often the essential character is it's conferred upon them by virtue of those finer details. I don't know if my colleague has anything to add to that, sir. From
Can I just, before we see if we can be helped further, I mean, it is a little ambiguous, the way it's been framed, isn't it? Because it talks about double glazing will be supported where it can be accommodated within the existing window or joinery or door joinery frames, which sort of implies, well, you can't change the frames, you can change the glazing, but not the frames. But if that's not the intention, it may be that, a better wording needs to be drafted in.
Thank you. My name's Tracy Ingle. I'm the Principal Planning Officer with Specialism in Heritage. Windows are an incredibly emotive subject. In fact, there's such a large section of the plan devoted to windows.
Yes, I've never seen a plan with so many pages on windows and doors.
Indeed. We're very proud of our windows and doors in Jersey. And what we try to do in the preamble to the policy itself is set out a matrix by which the decisions are made. In most cases, in Jersey, we have a tradition of 1 over 1, one large pane of glass over another that sits in a sliding sash. And in St Helier in particular, those are usually fairly thick in the joinery detailing. So if one wanted to retrofit a thin double-glazed unit, there is enough space to do that without damaging the frame, and enough space to put the extra weight that's required to balance the window as it slides up and down. So that's a change from the current position where we look to have single glazing, that we would allow the retrofitting of double glazing in existing frames when they can accommodate it, when they are historic windows. So it's not that we would accept the loss of the frames if they were historic and capable of repair. If they were not historic, then the replacement under the current policy and this proposed policy would be acceptable. If they are historic and they are beyond repair, then replacement is acceptable. And if the appropriate form of replacement can accommodate double glazing, that is also acceptable. And just by way of illustration, if it in St Helier is a 2 over 2 frame, then it can usually be retrofitted. And with the changes in glass technology, we now have 7.5mm glass that can now fit into a pattern of 6 frames over 6 windows in a 6 by 6 pattern. And so one of the issues has always been in Jersey to allow technology to catch up with policy to a degree and to facilitate the change when appropriate. But the bottom line in Jersey is that we have few precious historic windows, and our first test is, if historic, can they be repaired? And that is the starting point. And if they can be repaired, what could we do to increase the thermal performance? So I was on site 2 days ago looking at different systems of draft proofing. And so it is not for us a matter of replacing historic windows in their entirety to meet managing emissions. It is that balance of embodied energy versus operational energy and looking after our finite historic environment. I think the final thing to say on this is that windows will reach the end of their lives. In Jersey, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of 19th century windows. We have a few 18th century windows, most of which are hidden in attics and nobody knows they're there. And we have probably 3 or 4 16th century windows and possibly 10 17th century windows. The 16th century windows are largely in museums. And so it is a matter of looking after our heritage in that regard to ensure it moves into the future. And then we always work with owners of historic buildings to find the correct measures to improve the thermal performance of their buildings. And it is not always the 10% of the facade that happens to have windows in. It is usually the roofs, the floors and the walls, which would have a much better payback for people improving their buildings.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. But to get back to your point, the frames, It's then a question, if they're beyond repair, then they could be changed. But if they're not, they're going to have to stay. That's, as I understand, broadly the position. So it's whether they be run beyond repair or not. Does that satisfy you?
No, that's my challenge. The number of reasons is I declare an interest, and Tracy knows my property, and she was being very supportive of replacing some double glazed windows recently in a cottage. I'm talking about the main house. The windows in the amendment that I cite, the example, are both in my house. One is double glazed, totally legally, and the other is single glazed, 1850s, 19th century windows. And the thermal efficiency I would question is whether you can actually fit the window into the existing frame. Bearing in mind the frames are, as I said, 150 years old. They've been sanded, they've been decorated, they've been changed, they've been repaired constantly over that period of time, which means that they will not necessarily the windows will not necessarily sit perfectly within the frame. The windows at the moment that I have, which I want to replace, when you've got the top and the bottom sash, you can stick a finger between the two. So when we have the debate here about how you can use curtains, I have restored my original shutters, and I use curtains and shutters, and I promise you I cannot open, in the winter, north-facing, I cannot open that window, the curtains and the shutters, to let in natural daylight. It just gets too cold. Bear in mind there's a bit of damp as well, which you can't get rid of either. So I would suggest that a full proper seal and a unit, fit for purpose unit, would be better. I did some canvassing with some architects and local joiners, and the comments that they make on on the replacement of the woods. One of them said, "If been forced to replace a window, why should inferior softwoods be used for the windows? Joiners are often forced to use exactly the same inferior softwood as they are having to repair and replace. They ought to be able to use hardwoods from sustainable forests." Which is not what the policy is. If you're going to repair the original softwoods and put maybe hardwoods in the windows, there's a disconnect. And one of the challenges repairing to existing windows is in situ repairs to delay in timber windows don't work. The repair is expensive and can still be seen through the paintwork. So this is going to apply to the frames. The windows will invariably suffer decay too within 10 to 15 years, kicking the can down the road. And the repair work will eventually will only delay the inevitable and lead to the full window. So I'm suggesting if we do have have a challenge within those windows, or wish to make your home more thermally efficient, we should be able to use sustainable hardwood frames and windows as the perfect fit in all cases, as long as they are aesthetically pleasing and don't take away from the nature of the building. And the other one is costs. We have to be sensitive. The casement windows in a heritage property are a luxury, and they're wonderful to enjoy. But some of the joiners are saying that just the repairs are 1.3 times the cost of fully replacing the windows with hardwood, far more sustainable products. And another comment was, by replacing the frames enables you to put a damp-proof course behind it, because it's the frames that tend to decay faster than the windows, because they are closest to the damp. I think that's enough now. You've got a lot to get through. I will not waffle any further.
Thank you. No, well, it hasn't been waffle at all. I won't mention this morning in that context. I don't think it's going to be a meeting of minds here.
I do understand that, but it's always done with great politeness, so thank you for that. There won't be a meeting of minds because the policy sets out to ensure that historic windows are retained and repaired. And whilst...
I think it's going to happen. Apologies, Tracy.
That's okay.
Only water.
Like we all went with, but you're fine.
Yeah, we've got enough flooding here, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thinking about retaining historic windows, it's not just about how they look. And in the Slate's proposition that came in, there are two photographs. No, one can't tell from the photographs which is double glazed and which isn't. But it's about authenticity, it's about significance, and it's about embodied carbon. So a window that's 150, 200 years old is a valuable thing. If the Deputy's amendment were to go in, then anyone who wanted to change that window out would be able to do so under the terms of the policy. They would still need to apply for planning permission, of course, but the planning permission would need to be granted because the policy would say if you choose to change your frames and your glass, you can do so. If I might just gently push back on the polling of joiners and architects. Again, out on site 2 days ago, I agreed that a sill that needed to be repaired could go back in hardwood, but the repairs to the frames themselves on the corners needed to be softwood, because if you put hardwood next to softwood, then the repair will break down because you get differential thermal splitting. In situ repairs are challenging, and we have on occasion seen poor quality repairs come in and say that they've broken down and therefore we should be allowed to replace the whole window. What we tend to do with people in that situation is look to take the window out, put it onto a bench and carry out full repairs, and that's usually the most satisfactory way of doing it because the parting beads, the meeting rails and everything else can be brought back together to function appropriately. I don't recognise the 1.5 times cost of repairing windows. I believe that based on my experience, repairs are usually cheaper. They can be relatively expensive, but a new sliding sash window fitted in Jersey, you're looking at around £3,500–4,000. You don't generally get that sort of cost for repairs. And if you do bench a window to repair it, then when it goes back, of course, you put a damp-proof course in. You also put a lead on the sill so that it doesn't actually break the sill down, because granite is porous and it's one of the basis of our issues of cold and damp buildings in Jersey. So what we're looking to do with this policy is to keep that matrix of, is it historic? Yes. Can it be repaired? Yes. Then let's repair and keep it. If it can't be repaired, then it's replaced, and it's replaced with as close to authentic as we can achieve. And if double glazing fits into that, then that would be supported. If we move back from that, then any application we get to replace a historic window would need to be approved.
Yeah. Am I allowed to ask?
Yes.
So, Tracy, you said frames and glass can be replaced in the middle. Words I picked up in the middle of your conversation. Can you clarify that for me kindly?
If a historic window is beyond repair, then it can be replaced. In some cases, especially with sliding sash windows, we'll tend to find that it's the frames themselves are actually in good condition. It's the box frames around the outside which rot because of their proximity to the granite. So sometimes we actually reuse the sash in a new box frame, and other times it's the other way around. The box frame is in good condition, but the sashes have failed, and therefore you replace the sashes. So the aim is to repair so far as possible, rather than take the whole window out at 150 years old, put it in a skip, and then go and buy a brand new window with double glazing, with argon in the middle, which is actually a petroleum gas, and all of the carbon that's required to achieve that. It's a balance, and it's a difficult balance, and I have spent time with you and other customers, owners, agents, trying to work out where that tipping point is, and each case is different, and each case is challenging, and each case one has to listen to the building owner and their aspiration and try and meet them halfway so far as possible. And this policy allows that conversation to happen. If Deputy Hewlin's amendment were accepted, then the conversation could no longer happen because every listed historic building window would have to be replaced.
Okay.
Can I make one comment? And
then I think we've probably
I think you're
dealt
right.
with it.
There is an irony here. I can talk primarily about my personal circumstances when I recently had planning permission approved in order to replace 5 casement windows in a cottage because they were beyond repair. Embarrassingly, they were beyond repair. I accept as the owner it shouldn't have happened. Other properties, I have got immaculately looked after windows that have cost a fortune, which are not beyond repair, therefore cannot be replaced. And therefore that tends to say, let them rot and then you will change, which is a... But I thank you, sir. Thank you.
That would be important. Can I just get clarification from you, Ms. Dingle? The amendments that are being accepted by the Minister, are you advising the Minister? Are you content with the amendments?
Yes, I think the amendments take a step into the 21st
Fine.
century.
Good. Excellent. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you, Mr. Hewlin. If you wish to leave us, you are let out of school, sir. Conservation areas, interesting subject we're coming on to. Conservation areas. The National Trust and the Society want, I see, they want 4 conservation areas designated per year during the plan period. It's taken 35 years and you haven't got one yet. How are you going to get 4 every year?
Stephen Fell for the Société Jerseyese. I've agreed with my colleagues here that I'll speak first on this matter. Our written submissions to you have set out the background. We've actually been waiting 35 years for conservation areas, and despite many commitments in successive island plans, nothing yet has been delivered at all. So forgive us for being a little bit suspicious about the current promises that are being made in this draft island plan. No one doubts that there ought to be a refocus from individual listed buildings into area conservation. I think that principle is so well established. And obviously good heritage in places like St Helier and other built-up areas does support the visitor economy and supports a sense of local identity and well-being. So there's no argument about the principles here. There seems to be a reluctance on the part of government to actually get on and do this, and it's not as complicated as might be made out. We strongly believe, I'll make 6 points if I may.
Have you made them in your submission?
They are refocusing, which I think will help you, because they summarise. But the first one is that this matter is now extremely urgent. Because
next point, I understand that.
It's been very clear from recent work between the Société and the National Trust in looking at areas that some historic areas are now so badly damaged that where they may have been fit for conservation areas in the past, it's now too late. We are concerned about the possible delay in designation that might arise from the necessary subordinate legislation, in other words, changing things like the General Development Order, and then the consultation on the criteria for designation, which haven't been published yet, then the consultation on individual conservation areas. So we would like you to seek a response perhaps from the department as to when they think it would be possible to commence the first conservation area assessment. Because we're conscious that once the island plan is adopted, then development will continue apace without the background material to inform designations or inform decision making. This is why we feel that the pace not only should be increased of designation, but can be, because I think between us, Mrs. Taylor and I have many years of experience in designating conservation areas in the UK. The assessments in our recent experience have taken 2 or 3 days, and that brings the assessment to the point where it can be consulted on. So I think this is more a matter of will than practicality, that the pace of change, or the pace of designation rather, on smaller conservation areas could proceed fairly quickly once the basic principles and procedures have been established. I mean, it's very clear looking at our fellow island, Guernsey, which has 27 conservation areas, that they carry on quite well without restricting development. and we just simply can't understand why the same is not possible in Jersey. One concern that we have, which we've raised, is the change of terminology in the proposed Jersey policy from preserve and enhance, which is the key phrase in conservation areas elsewhere, to protect and improve. The reason we're concerned about that is that those new terms will need to be interpreted by decision makers, and that may lead to further delay before the terminology is settled. We have urged or encouraged the authority here to use the familiar phrasing, but they're using protect and improve because those are the words in Jersey law. And if that is your belief too, sir, we would suggest that there are very clear definitions of those terms, protect and improve, in the glossary to the Island Plan, or preferably in the preamble to policy HE3, so that decision makers down the line are very clear what they're trying to achieve. Our final point, sir, is that we believe the priority for designation should respond to the likely areas which are under pressure from development. In other words, don't go for the easiest areas first, go for the most difficult. And that, of course, is in St Helier, where the considerable burden of future development is being placed by this Island Plan. So we would urge you, sir, to explore that issue with the authority as to why they should not jump straight into this issue, enter into positive dialogue with the development community, and try to seek a meeting of minds on how best to proceed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The Minister has a list, but no priority on the list. So, and you want St Helier put it at the top of the list?
Absolutely, yes.
But do you have any problem with the list itself?
We do not have, except for the point I've just made, that some of those areas that are on the older lists have been so damaged that they wouldn't perhaps make the grade.
Okay.
If I could just pass to my colleague, Mrs Taylor, who wants to make a further comment on this.
Yes, just in
Mrs.
relation
Taylor.
to the list, sir. I would be a bit nervous about 100% reliance being put on that list, partly for the reason Mr Feld has explained, but also I do consider there are some areas that are worthy of conservation area status that aren't included in the list. And the list has existed for quite a long time, and the situation in many places has changed a lot, and also perceptions of what is important have changed. So I think really a review is needed also of the list, and in fact whether it needs to be expanded.
You are really very ambitious, aren't you? You want 4 a year and an expanded list.
Yeah.
Well, there we go.
Sir, could I come back very briefly on the point about St Helier? It is a big, interesting town, and we would not expect or wish the whole of the urban area of St Helier to be approached in one go. There are many, many different parts of the town that have quite distinctive characteristics, and we would therefore suggest that
I've seen
that. So there ought to be perhaps there should be a prioritisation of different parts of the town following the likely level of development.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Mr. Farn.
Thank you, sir. It's picking up on the point Mr. Fell made about the will to carry out conservation areas. My point might be technical. I was wondering why this is dealt with as a proposal in the plan rather than a firm policy to which the Minister would, I believe, must have greater regard to satisfying. So the designation of conservation areas could be dealt with as a policy.
Right, thank you. Yes, sir, from the architects.
Yes, Richard Lasware on behalf of the Association of Jersey Architects. Just want to support the Société in two of the things they've said. First of all, I think the word enhance, it really is essential to have that word rather than improve inserted into the plan. Secondly,
Oh, sorry, can you just tell me why?
because improve could be taken to be looking backwards. Improve could be finishing off the historic fabric, or could be purely related to a heritage matter. Whereas if you have, for instance, an empty site in a conservation area, then rather than a piece of pastiche infill, then a building that was modern in every way, but took clues from the surroundings, would be permitted. Now, this is the case, albeit after quite a few struggles in the UK, but that is how the word enhance can be interpreted as promoting sensitive, contextual, but modern interventions in conservation area. I think, and I would hope Tracy would agree, that pastiche is not the way forward. So that's why I think enhance is a much better word than improve. Secondly, on conservation areas, we entirely support conservation areas. Us architects worked tirelessly and without pay 50, 40 and 35 years ago to go round the island ourselves and to try to promote the listing of historic buildings. This was in the face of indifference at planning. What we don't want to see, though, is a mess between Grade 4 listings. So currently in a lot of conservation areas there are a lot of Grade 4 listed buildings. Now, this is a grade below that which buildings would be listed in the UK. It's
Yeah, I understand. I've seen.
And therefore there must be some mechanism for, we feel, removing Grade 4 listing for buildings within conservation areas, that you can't have a double listing for the same purpose.
Right, thank you. Well, I think that latter point is probably a matter for the detail when the conservation area work is done, rather than for something that needs to be drafted into the plan at this stage. Can I come to the States in a response to any of those points?
Perhaps if I can, I'll start and perhaps then ask my colleague if I've missed any elements. Firstly, the points raised by Mr. Fell, and of course it would be remiss of me, sir, to suggest that if it was a matter of will or why Mr. Fell perhaps didn't address these matters while he was working for the government. But I won't labour that point, sir. In terms of one of the principal reasons why this hasn't been given effect is simply because we don't have the legal framework to designate conservation areas on the face of the current planning and building law. And there is a proposal that is a proposition that's currently before the Assembly, lodged by the Minister for the Environment, to amend planning and building law. The Planning and Building Law, it's Planning and Building Law Amendment number 8, which contains a range of measures, one of which is the powers to enable the designation of conservation areas. The Assembly have approved the principles of that proposed legislative change. The matter's been called in by the relevant scrutiny panel, and the matter is, I believe, due to be debated by the Assembly in January of next year, sir. So that enabling legislation, we hope, will be very quickly with us. In terms of the other issues raised, in terms of the subordinate legislation and the perhaps if I can call it the other sort of policies to enable the designation of conservation areas, the Minister for the Environment is very keen that we progress that work, sir, in parallel with the changes that are being made to the primary legislation, and we've commenced work to do that. And I think the other element around conservation area assessments, We have a service level agreement with Jersey Heritage, who are essentially serve as the government's advisors on the identification and value of heritage in the island, sir. And we would envisage that the work that Jersey Heritage undertake on our behalf would seek to address this issue of identifying and assessing potential conservation areas within the island. And it's relevant to note that as part of Jersey Heritage's work, they've established something called the, I think it's called the Listing Advisory Group panel. Roger, sorry about that. So Listing Advisory Panel, which includes representatives from the Société, the AJA, and the National Trust for Jersey, I believe. So we're very keen to embrace the expertise that exists in the island's third sector, sir, to assist with the identification and assessment of potential areas in the island that might become conservation areas. In terms of the list of areas that might be identified and assessed for potential conservation area designation, I think the Minister's already indicated in his statement response relative to the amendments that he's minded to broaden that list, sir. I don't think the list set out in the amendment is an exclusive list either, and we would anticipate that some of the areas that perhaps Mrs. Taylor is thinking about would indeed be picked up through the process of looking at across the island at potential candidates for designation. In terms of the terminology that's used, Mr. Fell's right. The framing of the policy thrust for conservation areas as set out in the draft plan is derived from our legal framework here in Jersey, which does use the words protect and improve, sir. And the plan does define protect in the body of the text leading up to the policy regime for the historic environment, and that's where it should keep safe from harm. In terms of improve, I'm not sure that is defined, but that I'm sure would be an area where the Minister would be content to provide additional clarification. In terms of other issues that have been raised, the point that Mr. Le Sueur raised relating to encouraging design that may not be of the same historic character, but essentially good design that serves to make a positive contribution to a conservation area. I think in the Minister's response to that particular issue that was raised during the consultation on the draft plan, the Minister's acknowledged his willingness to respond favourably to that particular suggestion, sir, in his post-consultation response. And then just on the matter of detail around the Grade 4 listed buildings, if any of them were embraced by a conservation area, the primary purpose of those Grade 4 listings is essentially to protect the townscape value and character of those buildings, and so as you suggest, sir, it would be a matter then to review the individual designation of those buildings as part of the work that would flow from the subsequent work that would flow from the designation of the conservation area, with a view to potentially removing those Grade 4 listed buildings. I don't know if there are any other points that you'd want to raise. Okay.
Right, you have 3 points, Mark.
Thank you. The first one is the General Development Order. There was some consultation carried out in 2012, going back a little way, with regard to amendments and modifications to the GDO. And the question that was specifically asked was whether the historic protection elements within the General Development Order were too much, or they needed to be relaxed, or were they too loose and needed to be tightened. it was a typical bell curve of responses from how dare you tell me what I can do with my house, it's my house, right through to we should preserve everything that's listed and not touch it. And in the middle, there seemed to be a feeling that what we'd got was generally acceptable. In framing the General Development Order, there is already provision for controls within conservation areas, and as part of the current work to look again at conservation areas, we are looking at the General Development Order to make sure that we are correctly identifying controls for character, and that is public streetscape character, or in Jersey's case, potentially seascape character as well as streetscape. And so that work is in hand and will be an important part of thinking about the criteria and defining character as we move forward. Thinking about which areas could come forward or should come forward, one of the experiences of designating conservation areas in the UK is that a key component of this is community engagement. And if one lives in a conservation area and is signed up to it, it's far more likely that the conservation area will be managed positively into the future, because by definition most incremental changes are to people's private property. And therefore where we go first, I think, would be helpful to have a community that would be behind us, and I think that's one of the challenges perhaps of certain parts of St Helier. That's not to say that St Helier shouldn't be targeted, because clearly it is under development pressure. And then finally, just thinking about the principles of conservation areas, it's really positive to hear the support for conservation areas, because that's not always the case, and it certainly hasn't always been the case in Jersey. And it is that understanding of defining characters to ensure that we have appropriate contextual design, and that is quite rightly not pastiche. That is actually thinking about setting our store out for the future in a positive way, and therefore the characterisation work, I think, needs to be very carefully done to help decision makers and indeed the Minister in the future to make those sorts of very challenging decisions, which on the face of it today appear very quick to do, but actually in practice can be quite difficult to actually ascertain.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Very brief response to my friend Kevin on the other side of the room, who made a gentle comment that brought into challenge my professional commitment to conservation. I know he didn't mean to put it quite that way. I was brought to the island, sir, in 1995, and to concentrate on the listing of buildings, which at that time was only 35 years behind best practice. So that is why
now
I was
you've got
unable
lots,
to
I gather.
move on to conservation areas. Just a final comment in response to Tracy Ingall's comment there about where to focus the urgency. I do accept that an important part of conservation area work in the current climate is to involve communities. But the fact that in some parts of St Helier there is no community because sites are vacant or awaiting development should not put them back in the queue. I think there is a community of development interests which is quite legitimate, and I see no harm in parallel with looking at more residential communities in looking also at the development world and the expectation the island has of improving parts of the town centre.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to move on from conservation areas. It'll be interesting to see how things develop over the next few years. Policies H1, H2, I think it's H2 in particular, Mr. Farnham, that you're worried about. The second paragraph is what's worrying you, I think, mostly. No, H1, I think we're on H1, are we? Yeah, H1, HE1.
So I've read the Minister's response to my representation.
Yeah.
And I was broadly happy with that response. I understand from, Kevin's team that certain changes are in place regarding the GDO, which might clear up my concern about the works the interior of grade 4 buildings, where the public have great confusion over what does and doesn't require consent. And I did have a comment about the main paragraph, which was, I thought it was unwieldy, and
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm not too dim to understand these things, but frankly I found it very difficult to follow, and it made me wonder whether the public, in trying to understand what they are allowed to do or what they're guided to do with their own listed buildings, whether they're going to understand it.
Yeah, I've noted your suggested wording. Does the States have a view about that? You've seen the wording that has been suggested.
We have, sir. In terms of our detailed response to that, I can't advise definitively whether we would be happy with that, but if there are word changes that would help clarify the intent of the policy, we're always willing to consider those, sir.
So the ones that have been suggested, I mean, I must say to you, it seemed to me that the wording that was being suggested seemed clearer to me than the wording you have in the plan, frankly.
If that's your view, sir, we'd be happy to consider your recommendation along those lines.
Okay. All right.
So if I might just add, there was a discussion previously about changes of a couple of words, and this relates to policy H1. In my view, if the words are changed to relate better to the planning law, that is actually helpful.
This is your betterment point.
Yes, and this discussion about enhance or improve, etc. Thinking about what happens with a planning application right from day one, when you're advising someone who owns a listed building, right through to the potential of being at the Royal Court, discussing these things. If the state's policies relate back to the planning law, then that is a far easier, far more robust position. And I think actually the previous wording was perhaps open to challenge.
Can you just help me, somebody, on the law? I thought I read somewhere that Jersey law talks about conserve, protect, and improve. I think that was the phrase I read somewhere. Is that right?
That was the state's response to the point I made, which I thought was a reasonable response.
Yeah, and
That's the word that the Royal Court uses.
so conserve, protect, and improve. So why doesn't the policy then reflect that and improve? Implies, because one's talking in terms of the policy, you're talking about conserve or improve rather than and improve.
If I could read the purpose of the law, it says to provide the means to protect, enhance, conserve and to use wisely the natural beauties, natural resources and biodiversity of Jersey, and to preserve and improve Jersey's general amenities. So the use of the word preserve has created issues in terms of interpretation through planning inspectors and indeed at the Royal Court. And therefore a move away to conserve is a more flexible approach and moves us to allow neutral as well as positive changes. The semantics of improve or enhance, I take the point that one could see improve as a backward look, but equally I see improving as a positive forward look, whereas enhance implies a positive change to improve. Improve potentially has a wider flexibility to it.
I'm not so worried, frankly, about the difference between improve or enhance. I'm worried about the word and or the word or.
Indeed.
The word and implies that you've got to do, it's not just a case of protecting or conserving. It's going beyond that. And we've had this debate in the UK for years, and I think the courts have pretty much settled it now that as long as you're not doing any damage, it's okay. You don't have to improve. But this implies that you have to improve.
So I think, if I may, in terms of policy HE1, the policy talks about must protect. So there's an emphasis on must protect, and then talks about all proposals should seek to improve. So that's not we're not saying that's a mandatory obligation in policy terms in that in policy HE1.
No, I understand that, but my question is, shouldn't it be mandatory, given the way your law is framed?
Well, I think we've had challenge, sir, in relation to the assessment of proposals that affect listed buildings, and I think principally in relation to setting. So I think the key issue there has been around seeking to protect the settings of listed buildings. But I think I'm right in saying that the case law does not necessarily require an improvement. Is that the case? Yeah.
So the case law reflects that, and
That's right.
that I think was your worry, Mr. Farnham, about the second paragraph in HE1. All proposals should seek to improve the significance.
Yes, it was. It was just introduction of betterment into the policy.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I don't support improvement. You know, something I
Of
do
course.
a day-to-day job. But
Yeah.
actually, in some instances, it's not possible to enhance the situation. So somebody could fall foul of the policy simply by virtue of an existing context.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yes, Mrs. Smith.
I was just going to make the same point I think that we're all making, that the difference between what the law currently requires and how it's being interpreted by inspectors in appeals, and how Tracy and her colleagues are having to work with it on a daily basis, and us as environmental consultants are trying to interpret it for our clients. There is at the moment an unfortunate disconnect, which is leading to case law that doesn't necessarily reflect the intentions of the policy, but then unfortunately we're stuck with reflecting that because of precedent, and how that then works for the next interpretation.
So you're saying on appeal, the inspectors are taking a pragmatic view of the situation?
Yes. And in some cases are applying it as though it were from a more English-centric focus, which doesn't necessarily reflect the Jersey vernacular. And it's in an attempt to be helpful, but it is making an already delicate situation rather more complicated for everybody. It was an observation, and absolutely not criticism at all. Purely an observation, because I work in this area, as does Anthony and Tracy. Thank you.
Okay. Right. HE2, Mr. Farnham, you're worried about the way it's drafted, and you're worried about it catching modern extensions to, say, to a listed building, and they would then be required to make a planning application, etc., etc. And the Minister suggested some amendments. I don't know if you're content.
Yes, broadly
You are.
content with that. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. And is it the same with your worries about the interior fabric of a grade floor listed building?
I'm satisfied in so far as the department are saying that the general development order is being looked at to try and resolve that issue. But as it stands at the moment, it's very difficult to inform a homeowner of a listed building, which is grade 4, whether they actually require consent under the law to undertake certain works to the interior of their property. And you on a day-to-day basis, you end up in a very difficult situation of explaining they have a listed building, so technically they require consent, but you probably won't be asked for it. and in reality, there's not dealing with Tracy per se, obviously she's very professional at her job, but in asking the planning department, you can receive different answers on a different day to whether consent is required. And that to me seems to be a totally unsatisfactory situation, and not something that the department would want either. But it does, the key point is it does leave homeowners potentially in a situation of worrying about whether they're breaking the law, whereas others might actually be doing so.
Yeah. I get back, I guess, to a point we've made quite a lot. Well, is there anything we can do about it in the plan, or is this just a case of good practice? My
suggestion was that should be clearly stated within the policy and or at least the preamble, but the Minister's response has said this is going to be resolved through revision of the GDO, and that would seem to be the most appropriate place to do it.
Good. That's helpful. I don't think we need to discuss that any further. Good. And again, I'm coming to you, Mr. Farman. You've raised an issue about this potential tension between protecting the setting of listed buildings, and we know there are lots of listed buildings in St Helier, and the question of having to make them the best possible use of land for housing development, and that may well mean higher densities in St Helier, and there's this tension about it. And you suggested trying to resolve this, or at least address this to a degree, by referring to high quality architecture, for example. I just wonder how effective that sort of remedy is, or if it just means that it's words which people can interpret in different ways depending on how they look at the quality of the architecture.
So I think you're possibly right with your latter point. My general point was that I wanted the preamble of the policy to bring this issue out into the open, because as Mr. Fell was speaking about before, there's great development pressure across the island, but in St Helier in particular, and we see on a weekly basis significant schemes being submitted which do impact on the setting of listed buildings. And as a practitioner in this field, the advice is, yes, it will have some harm to the setting of listed buildings. You need to mitigate that through your design, and then the decision maker then tends to state that the housing need overrides the heritage need. Now that's fine, that's a mature planning decision. My point was that given that everyone in the process understands this tension and probably understands it's going to become greater, can we not be a little bit more open about it within this part of the island plan, and perhaps try and suggest a way to build in mitigation right from the start. And my suggestion was that the Minister encourage high quality design even when there are potentially negative impacts on the setting of listed buildings. And it would seem the preamble is probably the best place to do that, but I'd leave that for a matter for yourself, whether to adjust the policy.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think one partial solution to this is to have solid supplementary planning guidance of the sort that's been written by Historic England, which deals with the setting of listed buildings more than adequately. It's a very thorough document, now in its second iteration, which does help decision makers to understand what setting actually means in all variable circumstances. And that's the starting point. Once you've identified whether the setting is harmed or not, then you can go on to make judgments about whether that can be mitigated sufficiently if a development is causing some potential harm. So I think that would be my suggestion to you, sir, that the supplementary guidance is critical in this area because it's potentially complex for decision makers to fully understand.
Good.
Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you. Can I have a response from the States?
Just in terms of the issue of guidance on settings, we are intent on producing guidance on setting. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
That would be supplementary planning guidance you're talking about. You've got lots of work to do, Mr. Penning.
We like to keep ourselves busy, so.
Right.
And for the first time, setting is actually in the preamble to the policy and defined as such.
This is the first time, you say?
That setting has been stated in the preamble to the policy as to what we actually mean by setting. It was referred to in the past. This actually seeks to set it out. And the other part of this is good quality architectural design, of course, is within and engendered in the general design policies.
Yeah.
And so there's a question about whether one should cross-reference or rely on general design policies to set out what is and what isn't good, contextually sensitive architecture.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Those cover all the points that I had about this particular topic. Is there anything anybody else wishes to raise? Yes, sir. National Trust, I think.
I think what's become abundantly clear over the last few days is the fact that lots of work needs to be done, lots of work is being done, and I hope that the inspectors will give some recommendations about how that is going to be resourced to ensure that actually it does get done. Because it's very easy for us all to turn around here and say we're going to do this or we're going to do that. But actually if the money's not there and it's not resourced, it won't get done. And if you look at previous island plans, there are policies still awaiting to be done. And largely they haven't been done because the resources haven't been there. So I just think, you know, you talked about us being ambitious. Equally, I would say the States is being ambitious. But if it's going to fulfil that ambition, it needs to be resourced.
Thank you. I don't know how much notice the Minister would take of us on that point, but I do understand the point you're making. Anybody else?
Ina Gardner would like to speak.
Ah, right. Deputy Gardner.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Apologies, I twisted my ankle and I couldn't join today in person. And it's interesting that my amendment on policy HE1 connected to disability access, especially to the public historic buildings. I read the Minister's response, which I'm grateful that because he's minded to accept the amendments. I tried to make my mind, and I'm still not sure, to be honest. The main purpose of this amendment is to give a bit more clarity and opportunity to the planners that can benefit from the guidance from us politicians providing on the priorities between disability access and the heritage. I understand that it should be balanced, and I can see Minister's response and balance, but I'm not sure when it will come that it's impossible how the priority would work out. It's impossible to retain everything, like States building, for example. States building, public gallery is not accessible. And I'm not sure if it's possible to make accessible without with mitigations.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're taking a realistic view of it, because, you know, that would be what you would be seeking to achieve, but there may be circumstances where it's just impossible. But I don't know that that the Minister or that we could recommend anything to the Minister that would resolve that problem. It's going to be one of those tricky issues that planning is often facing, where you have to balance things, and you may simply have to accept a compromise in some circumstances. But as I read it, the plan is making the point that you would certainly seek it, and you would only compromise if there wasn't any other choice. Is that fair enough, Mr. Penny?
I think that's right, sir, and I think clearly we're dealing with trying to set an appropriate policy framework here. And as you suggest, sir, I think a lot of these circumstances, a lot of these situations will come down to the individual circumstances that apply in a particular case.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And anything else, Deputy Gardner?
No, thank you.
Well,
thank you.
I hope, is it your ankle that you've sprained?
Yes.
Well, I hope your ankle gets better quickly. We look forward to seeing you in a week's time. Good. Thank you. Right. If there's nothing else, thank you very much for attending, ladies and gentlemen, and we will end the session, and we won't be sitting tomorrow. We won't need to. So we will see you in about 10 days' time. Thank you very much.